Hurricane Milton, remember when that was just a name on a list?
Yeah.
Now it's like, a Category 3 monster heading straight for Florida.
Yeah.
We're talking like potential 10 to 15-foot storm surges in Tampa Bay.
Wow.
And this thing was this close to being a Cat 5 just recently.
Yeah.
We're diving into the latest updates from NBC, but also something even more crucial from AP News.
You see, anyone in Hurricane Milton's path, the immediate danger is obvious.
Yeah.
But what often gets missed is how differently a disaster like this hits, depending on who you are.
Exactly. So we've got millions under evacuation orders, tornado watches.
Wow.
The NBC article really paints the picture of just how big this storm is.
Right.
But the AP piece, that's where it gets unsettling. They focus on Florida's immigrant communities.
Right.
Folks who might be working in agriculture, construction, those kinds of jobs.
Right.
And the challenges they face are just heartbreaking.
What's fascinating and deeply concerning is that for many, the hurricane almost feels like just another problem.
Oh, wow.
On a very long list.
Right.
When you're already dealing with language barriers, limited resources, maybe even fear about your immigration status.
Right.
A hurricane on top of that.
Yeah.
It's overwhelming.
It's scary, right?
Yeah.
Like, imagine trying to figure out an evacuation route when you don't understand the language the warnings are given in.
It's terrifying.
Right.
And then you add on recent political changes.
Yeah.
Like that 2023 immigration law in Florida.
Right.
It's created this climate where even if officials say, come to the shelters, we're not checking immigration status.
Yeah.
There's this ingrained fear, this distrust.
Which is exactly what keeps people from getting help, even when they desperately need it.
Tragically so.
Yeah.
It's this perfect storm of vulnerability.
Right.
Where systemic issues collide with an immediate crisis.
Okay, so before we get too deep into that, let's quickly recap what NBC is reporting on the storm itself. It's late Wednesday.
Right.
Hurricane Milton is still a major threat.
Right.
Landfall is expected any time now, and almost 6 million people across 11 Florida counties are under evacuation orders.
Okay.
They're urging anyone still in the evacuation zones to get out now.
Right.
On top of that, South Florida is also under a tornado watch.
Oh, wow.
So the danger is really coming from all sides.
And, for someone like Lupita Lara, who the AP article focuses on, these logistical challenges become even more daunting.
Right.
She's a mother relying on the Farm Worker Association to translate information because she doesn't speak much English.
Wow.
Imagine trying to get your family to safety, understand evacuation routes.
Right.
And on top of that, you're trying to secure a spot at a special needs shelter for your son.
Right.
Talk about being caught in a system
that
doesn't seem built for you.
It's like every system is tested during a disaster.
Right.
Yeah. And what we're seeing here is how badly some folks are let down by those systems.
And that's precisely where Lupita's story becomes this tragic illustration of the larger issue.
Right.
She's not an isolated case. She represents this huge population of people who fall through the cracks.
Yeah.
Because of things that frankly, have nothing to do with the hurricane itself.
Right. It's easy to look at a hurricane, at the sheer force of nature and think, well, what can you do?
Exactly.
But when we talk about Lupita, about those systemic issues, that's where we see the difference between weathering a storm and truly being resilient.
Exactly. This AP article does a great job of highlighting organizations that are trying to bridge that gap.
Okay.
The Farm Worker Association of Florida, the Florida Immigrant Coalition, the Hope Community Center. They're doing the work of translating vital information into Spanish, French, African languages. Recognizing that immigrant doesn't mean one language, one experience.
Like you're already in a crisis here. The last thing you need is to be deciphering information in a language you barely know.
And it's more than just translating, right? It's about understanding the nuances of each community, their cultural context. They're utilizing trusted community leaders, those informal networks that already exist. Because if you're afraid to talk to officials, Maybe you will listen to someone you already know from your church or your child's school.
So it's about building trust, which, let's be real, is in short supply.
Yeah.
When it comes to institutions and immigrant communities, especially in a place like Florida right now.
Sadly, that's true.
Yeah.
But these organizations, they're not just showing up during the hurricane.
Right.
They're there year-round, building those relationships.
Yeah.
And that's what long-term resilience looks like.
Right.
Not just sandbags and shelters.
Yeah.
But having a support system you already trust before disaster strikes.
So in a way, this hurricane, as awful as it is, becomes a bit of a case study.
Right.
What happens when these communities who are already struggling are hit with a massive natural disaster?
And what's crucial for you to take away from this is that the impact goes far beyond the immediate danger of the storm.
Right.
We're talking long-term economic fallout, potential psychological trauma, even social displacement.
Wow.
These are folks who might work jobs without paid time off, who might be living paycheck to paycheck. Recovering from a hurricane for them, it's a whole other beast.
Especially if their home was damaged or they were in a flood zone.
Exactly.
Those are costs that can set people back years.
Absolutely. And this is where the lack of safety net truly becomes apparent.
Yeah.
If you're afraid to access government assistance, if your immigration status is uncertain, rebuilding your life becomes exponentially harder.
It's like this vicious cycle, right?
Exactly.
Where existing inequalities are exacerbated by these kinds of events.
Exactly. And it forces us to confront some really uncomfortable truths about who bears the brunt of these disasters.
Right.
It's rarely those with the most resources or the loudest voices.
Right.
It's those who are already struggling, who are often invisible in the larger narrative, yet are disproportionately impacted by these events.
So we've talked about the immediate danger of Hurricane Milton, the systemic challenges faced by immigrant communities. What does it all mean for the future? Like, what happens after the storm passes, after the news crews move on?
That's the question, isn't it? And it's where this idea of social infrastructure becomes so important.
Right.
We often focus on the physical rebuilding, right? Roads, buildings, power grids.
Right.
But what about rebuilding trust? Rebuilding lives that have been upended, not just by a hurricane, but by, years of systemic inequity.
You've mentioned that term a couple of times now, social infrastructure. For those of us who, aren't disaster relief experts, break that down. What does that actually look like?
Think of it as like the support systems. Right?
Okay.
The support systems that help communities withstand and recover from shocks. It's those community organizations, the churches, the neighborhood groups. They become lifelines in a crisis. Yeah. They can disseminate information in a way that's culturally sensitive. They often already have the language skills. And most importantly, they have the trust of the people they serve.
Which is something like a government agency, even at the best of intentions, might struggle to build overnight, right?
Exactly. If you're already afraid of being deported, a flyer in your language isn't going to magically erase that fear. But if someone from your child's school, someone who knows your name, tells you it's safe to go to the shelter, that's different.
It's about human connection at the end of the day.
It is, and it highlights how vital these organizations are. They're not just translating documents, right? They're translating fear, translating trauma into something approaching hope. And that's work that needs funding and needs support, and needs to be valued, not just when a hurricane hits, but year-round.
Because the next hurricane is always out there, right? What we're talking about isn't just reacting to disasters, it's preventing those disasters from becoming full-blown catastrophes, especially for the most vulnerable.
Exactly. Imagine if Lupita and countless others like her had access to resources before the storm hit. Imagine if their immigration status wasn't a barrier to seeking help. Imagine if those support systems were so strong that even in the face of a hurricane, there was a sense of, we've got this instead of what now.
That's a powerful image, and I think it challenges all of us listening to think about what role we can play. Because it's easy to hear about a hurricane, feel for those affected, and then kind of move on. But the rebuilding, the healing, that takes time, it takes resources, it takes a sustained effort.
And it takes a willingness to confront those uncomfortable truths we talked about earlier. Because we can't just wish away these systemic issues, right? We have to actively dismantle them.
So for you listening, here's what we want you to take away from this deep dive. What can you do in your community to build that social infrastructure? Who are the organizations already doing the work? How can you support them, not just during hurricane season, but all year long?
Because creating a more just and equitable world, a world where everyone has the chance to not just survive, but to thrive, that's not just about weathering storms. It's about changing the very climate that creates them.
Perfectly said. And on that note, we'll leave you with that to ponder. We'll be back next time with another deep dive. But until then, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.